This is Sylviane Grainsword. I'm here with L. Michelle Smith, and we are here for the Race and Reconciliation Initiative's Oral History Project interview. Today is March the 23rd, the year is 2022, and we are in the Harrison. Ms. Smith, thank you so much for joining us with Oral History.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. We are so looking forward to hearing your testimonials and hearing you share stories about your time here at TCU and thereafter. So let's start from the beginning. We're going to go fairly chronologically.
Sure.
Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, how you grew up, any cultural or religious influences in your upbringing, and things like that?
Okay. Well, I grew up in Dallas, Texas, in Oak Cliff. Currently, I am an author, a speaker, and an executive coach. And I am also an adjunct professor here at TCU. Sorry about that. But yes, I grew up in Oak Cliff back in the 70s. I was born on Van Cleve Drive, and this is going to have some significance a little bit later, in 1971. And I guess I'll go on and tell you. I would later learn that the first African American queen also grew up on Van Cleve Drive on the opposite side of the street, and she was crowned queen in 71, the year I was born.
Interesting.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Yeah, serendipity.
Yeah. So anyway, small family, one sister who's older than me, who graduated from Dallas Baptist University and got her master's and PhD from UNT, University of North Texas. Mother and father was a government worker, civil servant, worked for the U.S. Department of Labor and the U.S. Department of Defense, retired from the U.S. Department of Labor. My mom is a master teacher. She's retired, and she taught English for most of the time in junior high and high school. I went to a private school for most of my formative years, K through 12, all in one place, Tyler Street Christian Academy. That's where my parents wanted me to go. My sister also finished there. She was the first homecoming queen that was black there.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Runs in the family.
Yeah. You're going to see all the dots connect here in a minute. So anyway, finished from Tyler Street in 1989. And our church was right around the corner. I lived right down from the Cedar Crest Golf Course. And the church was the Good Street Baptist Church, which is historic in Dallas. It was pastored by the Reverend C.A.W. Clark, who was well known and influenced many pastors in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and also around the globe and around the nation too. But many of his mentees, if you will, are running some of the largest churches right now. But it was the pulpit where Jesse Jackson would come, during his run for presidency. It was the one place that MLK came when he visited in 59, I believe it was, because the other churches wouldn't have him. They were afraid. They thought they'd get bombed.
Yes.
So my pastor at the time had a lot of courage. Of course, I wasn't born during that time. But these are the stories that kind of undergirded the church and the history that was there. And a lot of the leadership lessons that I practice today, I learned at that church. Ultimately, I would leave Tyler Street and only had one college application because that's where my parents wanted me to go, just like they wanted me to go to Tyler Street.
No plan B.
No plan B. Dallas Baptist University. However, there was a little incident that happened at Dallas Baptist University with my sister when she was a senior. She was up for Miss DBU, and she was the favorite. They'd never before given it to anybody but a senior. And she did an amazing talent. She played the piano, music box dancer, and I was actually in the audience running a little remote controlled doll that, when she did a whole skit, she came out and put glitter on the doll shook, and she started to play the piano and the doll would dance. It was a nice little, everybody, ooh, it was a nice thing. But she was denied that. And my dad ended up going to, the administration to talk to them about what had happened. There was an audible gasp in the auditorium. So I had no plans to run for anybody's homecoming queen. Let's say that, because I'd seen it go wrong before.
Yes.
But anyway, my parents still were thinking that's where I should go to school. I didn't want to go. One, because of that, but two, it wasn't the place of my choice. And I had received, however, a full ride scholarship at that school. So in July, we showed up at that campus for registration, and I was met with, there's a mistake. Yeah. And I said, no mistake. Here's the letter. It says, congratulations, full ride scholarship. What are you talking about? I was there with my mom. This is July of 1989.
A month before school actually began.
See what I'm saying, right? So all of the admissions deadlines had passed.
Yeah.
And this is what we were dealing with. And they were like, no, there's some mistake. They go back in the back for 30 minutes or so, come back and say, well, there's a mistake. We don't have a full ride scholarship for you, but we can piece together something for you. What, you sing? Okay, we'll give you $1,000 for that. What, you were a cheerleader? So we'll give you $1,000 for that. By this time, my mom was livid.
Yeah.
I was like, we should have known, because we saw this happen before, right? Yeah, but we saw the way my sister was treated, just 5 years before.
Yeah.
And so my mom said, we got to think of something to do. She said, maybe we could go down the highway to TCU, but we're past admissions. So that's what we did. She went home, called admissions at TCU, pretty much begged, and said, would you just please have an interview with my daughter? She'll fill out the forms. I know it's past the deadline. And what they told her was bring her in for an interview, and she's going to have to write an essay. So we did that. About a week or two later, we're here at the registrar's, or admissions, at the Sadler Hall, and I went in for the interview and came out sweating bullets because, so much pressure.
Right.
I didn't know if I was going to get into college that year. And they said that I needed to write this essay. So I went home and I wrote an essay. And the essay was called The Plight of Chewing Gum. The Plight of Chewing Gum. You heard me right. And it was a first-person account of a piece of chewing gum that a little boy had pretty much slipped a pack into his mother's basket at the grocery store without her knowing. It slides across the glass, beat, and she's paid for it. And before you know it, the little boy does what a little boy does. He takes it to school in his backpack. And of course, you're hearing this from the gum, not the boy. And he slips a slice in his mouth, and it happens to be the one that's telling the story. Teacher catches him. Of course, what did he do? He takes it out, he sticks it under the desk, which is pretty much the end of the story. They liked it. They liked it so much, and they told me my essay was the reason why I got into the school.
Wow.
Needless to say that I'm a writer today.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I'm very blessed that was a skill that got me into TCU.
Yeah.
And that was a skill that would carry me through my life. And that ride home from TCU after the interview with my mother was not comfortable because they were expecting to pay a certain amount at DBU, which I think at that time was half the admissions that it was at TCU, which of course now is like 100% more than it was then.
Absolutely.
But they were going to strain to pay, and my mom was in the car just grilling me. What are you going to major in? I was like, I don't know. I'm kind of good at a lot of things. I don't know. You've got to figure it out because your daddy and I are about to pay money that we don't have, and we don't qualify for financial, and the whole thing.
Yes.
So at that point, I was like, English? I guess I'll be an English major.
Creative writing.
Right. So English writing emphasis was my major. And I also declared journalism as a double major and education as a minor because, again, my parents were like, you're going to get that teaching certificate because you need to fall back on something. That was just their thing. And this is a different generation.
Yes.
It's a generation that fought for access.
Yes.
They didn't realize how much choice we were going to have at this point.
They were very pragmatic. The way I see it. Yeah.
Very much so. But it's very interesting because later on in life, I would start my own business after making vice president before the age of 30 at a global agency.
Oh.
And it was just after 9/11, and I went to my dad and I was like, I think I could make money doing what I do. And he said, I want to hear what you have to say, which is interesting considering everything that I've just shared with you. And as it turns out, my great-grandmother was an entrepreneur that ran a grocery store by herself in Tyler, Texas in the 40s.
Wow.
With a gun on her hip. And he saw that. So he knew that entrepreneurship was honorable. It was something that you could do. And he never got to do it, so he was ready to back me. So anyway, a little bit more insight about my parents. But that should tell you a bit about me.
Yeah. So what was your knowledge of TCU before you enrolled?
Purple and white. That's really
all
it.
you knew.
That school down I-30. That's all I knew. I knew it was private.
Yes.
I knew it was less snooty than SMU. Is what I was told. I knew that there weren't many black people there. That wasn't going to be too scary. Although my little private school that I went to was very diverse. Lots of black, brown, and white kids. And we got along like gangbusters.
Oh.
And, you know, we used to say we did diversity before diversity was a word.
Right.
So to come to TC was kind of shell shock. Because I wasn't used to being around so many white kids and being outnumbered.
Yeah.
And many of them privileged. I didn't have that kind of money.
Right.
But my parents were still paying for it.
Well, they were investing definitely in knowing that it would yield results. So what about your high school peers? You say that you were like, you know, very close. So what did they think when they heard that, oh, you're attending TCU?
That's interesting because at that point, I don't really think I had that kind of contact with my high school friends. And it was such a quick turnaround. There's nobody to tell. I just needed to show up and be happy I was here.
Yeah.
Many of my high school friends, I probably had more friends in the class below me than the class with me because many of them went to other schools in like the 9th and 10th grade. So, I mean, there were colleagues more than friends. And then I also had friends that were in classes that were a little bit older than me that I was friends with because my mom taught them. And they just kind of saw me as Miss Smith's little girl, you know. So it's kind of the little sister.
Yeah.
And they all played basketball, and I cheered, so I knew them. But I wasn't close enough to be like, I'm going to TCU. Where are you going? It wasn't like that at all.
And what about in the Oak Cliff community, like your neighbors or your aunties?
The only real response that I got. Now I went to a historic church. I mentioned Good Street Baptist Church. Most of the kids there were either going to the HBCUs, the classy ones, Spelman, Howard, all of this. And, you know, every once in a while you would have somebody go to a state school, you know, maybe they'd go to UNT. But here I came talking about I was going to TCU, and I was pretty much kind of ostracized for it. You're going to that white school.
Oh, interesting.
You have to understand, this church was black excellence. And that's what they really expected us to just build a culture, you know. And most of those folks that were more senior, you know, the elders that were there, they went to HBCUs before they were called HBCUs because that was the only place they could go. So they wanted to carry that through. My parents finished Texas College, which is an HBCU. Mom pledged AKA. You know, I'm a legacy. I pledged here on this campus. My dad pledged Kappa. But it was interesting to me that my parents weren't pushing me to go to an HBCU. Very interesting. But anyway, there I was, and I wasn't shocked about it because when Joyce came back to the church and said she was going to DBU, deer in headlights. It's like, why are you doing that, right? Go to Spelman. Joyce is my sister. I'm sorry, my older sister. So yeah, it wasn't a big woo. You're going to TCU at the hometown. No.
Yeah, I see. So did any of the elders in your community ever try to go to TCU?
Yes, I did get a response from someone. It was a surprise to me. I.H. Claiborne was his name. He's passed away today. Stalwart in the community, head of the Masons there in Dallas. Just, you know, philanthropist. He'd done all sorts of things. And he was the lead of the Sunday school class that I was assigned to at the age of 13 to teach. And that was one of the things we learned at this church. Once you got to be a teenager, you were assigned an adult class to teach, which is where I got my speaking skills, to be honest.
Yes.
So one day, he learned that I got accepted, that I had applied and got accepted to TCU, that I was actually going. And he pulled me to the side and he looked at me and just peered in my eyes and said, "You're going to TCU?" It's like, "Yes, sir, I am." And he asked it again, "You're going to TCU?" "Yes, sir, I am." And finally I said, "Why do you ask?" He said, "I applied many, many years ago and they didn't let me come. I had to go to Jarvis." And I was like, wow, that was interesting. That was the first time that I actually began to kind of look back to see the history of schools, not just TCU, but others like it in the Southwest Conference back then.
Yeah.
They all had these little sister schools, if you will, where black students were sent if they applied to. So Jarvis Christian College, one of my best girlfriends, finished there. She's Miss Jarvis. She's a little bit older than me, also my sorority sister. But a lot of my friends went to HBCUs, not knowing the history of the TCU.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was really interesting to hear was, you know, even though our dorms weren't high tech at all back then. I mean, I remember my dad building a computer for me, but there was no broadband. There was no, he had to rig the dial in just so I could, you know, tap into the mainframe at Sid Richardson so I could get my Pascal homework done.
Oh, goodness.
Because he didn't want me walking in the middle of the night to the, and that's what we had to do because it was funny. You would sit down to this mainframe. There was no delete button. You had to get it right the first time. And if you didn't get it right, you had to start all over again. So we had to write it down on a pad, walk over to Sid Richardson, and type it in and pray it was right.
Right.
Right. So our dorm rooms didn't have any of that kind of thing, but compared to what Jarvis had,
Right.
it seemed high tech. So it was a real stark, very interesting fact for me to learn that that was what was going on. But that was my first indication that something was different.
Yes. Are you aware of the exchange program between TCU and Jarvis back in the 1960s?
Yes. That's when I found out about it.
Oh.
Yeah.
So do you know anything about the reason why? Because the students were supposed to complete that exchange program for a length of a week. So the students from TCU went to Jarvis and the students from Jarvis came here. So the Jarvis students stayed at TCU for a week. But the TCU students did not last at Jarvis for more than a day.
I didn't know that part. I just knew about the program.
Yes.
Interesting.
So, you know, with everything that you were telling me, and that was in the 90s, right?
Right.
So, God knows what it looked like back in 1964.
Well, I had two peers that lived in Jarvis Hall, and they were dancers. And that's where a lot of the dancers stayed. And just making that connection was very interesting.
Yes, absolutely. So you come here, you pledge AKA. Can you tell us about your fellow African American classmates? What was their attitude about, you know, being such a minority on campus?
It was hard. So the 3% of us that were there,
Right.
I remember that number very well, and I think it's up 2% now, maybe 3. But there were maybe 3 kinds of students. There were students like me. We were in the minority. Parents were paying out of their pockets. We were declared majors, and we were just here as students. Then you had those that were here with the ROTC. And I had 2 roommates that were in ROTC. 2 of them wound up being my sorors. They were also roommates. One's the chief nursing officer, by the way, in Portland, Oregon. Amazing. The other one is also a corporate nurse. But both of them are tremendously gifted, smart. I don't know any of my friends that didn't do well. But the other part of the black student body were athletes.
Right.
So they were on the football team, basketball team, you know, rarely swimming or anything like that. So we were separated from the bulk of the black student body, which is the athletes, because they were on a totally different schedule. And then when we would see them, we'd see them around the time it was time for lunch, maybe dinner. They had off in the training table. That's what they called it. They had their own diets. They had to eat when it was time to eat around practices and stuff like that. And I remember them saying to us when we had contact with them that they really yearned to be a part of the student body.
Oh, they did, huh?
Yeah, because it was a different experience.
Yeah.
They were on the job, you know?
Yes.
And we wanted them to participate too in Black Student Caucus, and you know, and during that time, the Cosby Show in a Different World would shut down this entire campus. I don't care what color you were.
I know.
Thursday night, everything shut down. You knew not to have meetings, anything
Yes.
like that. But the football guys had to go on and have practice.
Oh.
So they didn't have that experience like we did. So yeah, attitudes about being here. The dancers seemed to be fine with it because they had a really great dance school and they sought it out. But again, we're talking about a handful of students. One of them was my sorority sister. The other one, good friend of mine, she actually just roomed with the other soror. The rest of us, if you were in ROTC, you were probably just working your behind off just to be here. Because on the weekends, you were going to boot camp or whatever you were doing.
Right.
And I remember one of my sorors came back and quit after her first experience because her nails got dirty. And she was like,
yeah,
I was like, yeah, that you probably should have thought of that.
Yeah.
So she dropped out of ROTC. And then there were the athletes, and the athletes were just on a totally different vibe, you know, just they were doing that, hoping that they would get drafted, you know, come their senior year. They were on the job. I had this thought not long ago as I teach senior seminar for TCU right now, and I had a former graduate that just recently graduated speak to the class, and she was talking about community and how she was keeping that up even though she had found this job in Dallas. And she talked about how they have set up a time to eat with her friends every Thursday, even though, you know, they're spread out across the Metroplex. They call it dinner, family night. And whether they go to somebody's apartment or somebody's house or whatever they do, they rotate. And they have this. And it hit me at that point. I was like, that is so cool. Why didn't I do that? Well, when I went to class, I rarely saw my Black friends. I was an English major. I was the one.
Yes.
And when I graduated, we just dispersed. And, you know, before the internet was the internet, before Facebook was Facebook, there was no staying in contact, really.
Yeah.
So there was no real community. We weren't texting each other.
Right.
Nothing like that.
Right.
It isn't to say that I didn't know where my colleagues were, fellow graduates or whatever. But once you lost contact, you kind of lost contact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what got you into cheerleading then?
Well, I cheered 7th grade all the way through 12th grade. And my freshman year, I kind of checked out what was going on here, and I thought, well, maybe I do. They had a co-ed squad, but they introduced the idea of an all-girl squad, and I would be one of the first members of Uber, the inaugural, they called it Cheer 2.
Okay.
And it's kind of like a pom squad, if you will. We would dance, not like the showgirls, but we dance, but we'd also stunt,
Right.
we'd tumble, and we'd cheer. And it was interesting because the showgirls trying to figure out where we fit, and
Yes.
the co-ed was trying to figure out where we fit, and co-ed and Tier 2 had the same coach, Holly Rasco. Never will forget her. But yeah, I was an All-American cheerleader for NCA, which is the National Cheerleader Association. Got nominated for that twice in high school, so I knew I could compete.
Right.
So sophomore year, going into the sophomore year, I decided to try out. I made it. There were 2 Black students on that first inaugural team. Leanne Sims, if you haven't spoken to her, you need to. She was a Delta. She is a Delta. But Leanne Sims and I were the Black cheerleaders on Cheer 2, which was the first iteration of that group. Now that was an interesting situation because
You about it.
okay, she and I tried out without any thought of any kind of discrimination, nothing. We felt like we were going to go in there, do what we had to do. We'd make the squad or we wouldn't. But the scuttle among the Black students was they would let me on because of my skin color.
Oh.
And they wouldn't let Leanne on because she was darker skinned.
Oh.
And when it got back to us, we were mad. We were mad. And we're like, no, why would they do that? First of all, they're saying that I don't have the talent. You know, they're just going to let me on because of my skin color.
Yes.
And two, they're just going to write you off because you're dark and not even think about your talent. And we decided then, we're like, we both need to make this squad. And we did. And it was kind of like, and what? You know, now what do you have to say for yourselves, you know?
Right.
So there was this expectation for racism on the campus.
Yes.
And I can't say that it was unfounded because, and while colorism didn't seem to be at the root of it, it was just good old-fashioned racism, right?
Yes, it was.
And I ran into situations on the cheerleading squad. And as you know, I was a columnist for the Skiff. That column was very popular, so much so that I would get letters from faculty members as well as students. People would write in, and I'd get it in my P.O. box, you know, or they'd send it to the Skiff, and Alfred would give me the letters. And the feedback that I would get if somebody took the time to write me, it was always positive.
Always.
But here I was, now, yeah, the written ones were. Here I was introducing ideas of race in this column, and to my understanding, that hadn't happened before. And, you know, I didn't mince words. I would say things that needed to be said. In one situation, you can go back in the archives and find it. In fact, I understand that a few of my columns were brought up in the filing that happened, that class action lawsuit. Somebody told me, hey, you know, your name came up. I was like, how? They pulled my columns. One of them talks about how when I first went to one of the rehearsals or practices for cheerleader, it was springtime. The sun was out. You know, people had just, I would say spring. It was fall semester, but the sun was still out. And we'd just come out of the summertime, so people had tans. And I don't know if they still call it the beach between Shirley and Colby, but girls used to lay out on the beach between those two. I don't know if they still do it. You're nodding. Maybe they do. So people were working on their tans.
Yes.
I had a cheerleader come up to me who was not black and said, oh my gosh, look. And she held her arm up to mine and she said, I'm almost as dark as you. And then she put her arm up to another white cheerleader who was also tanning. And she said, ooh, you're dark, you nigger. And she said the N-word. And Leanne was standing right there. I was right here. And Leanne looked at me like, did I hear what? I say, oh yeah, you heard it. And I was like, I can't believe they said that in front of us. And I said, you know, that wasn't right. And they said, ah! They kind of laughed it off and went on. Well, I wrote about it in the Skiff. So, yeah, there were people who didn't like the column, especially the ones who had a problem.
Absolutely.
But in retrospect, I think the thing that struck me about it that I didn't think about before, I had faculty writing me because they said they enjoyed the column, but nobody approached me about my experience and said, how are you? Nobody went to Leanne and said, who did this to you? Nothing was done. But I guess it was okay to talk about it in the newspaper.
Right, you have that distance.
Yeah, and I guess I call it the burden of resilience. This is something that I write about now, where you've been through so much that you bend, you don't break. But when these things come around, like just Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, you learn to stand there and be gracious about it. When something probably should be said about it and done about it. So, you know, we were so resilient that it was almost like water off of our backs. And we never thought to go to somebody for some help about it. And nobody thought to come to us about it either.
But was there any type of institutional support for these situations at the time?
Not that I know of. I mean, I don't know who you would go to. I guess okay, so let me tell you this. We had a minority, director of minority affairs. And her name was Phyllis, and I'm trying to remember her last name. But Phyllis was from the islands. I don't know if it's Bahamas. You know who she is?
Yes.
She comes into play in the whole homecoming queen story. But before her, Logan Hampton, who is now the president of Lane College, who I'm still in contact with. I go to Lane and speak to students all the time. But that was our outlet. If something happened, we're supposed to go to Logan or Phyllis. But that's really all we knew. And I was writing about it in the paper, and I just felt like if somebody's going to say something, my byline was there, right?
Yes.
But no one said a word.
So if you know there was some kind of protocol, you would go to them, and so Phyllis would listen. And do what?
I don't know, because I never did it. I have no clue.
You're not aware of anybody else who actually filed a complaint? And there could have been a lot to complain about from what
There was a lot to complain about. Looking back, I can't believe a lot of the things that we went through, and it just was not addressed.